Mr. Jonathan Maberry, thank you so much for joining us here on Talking Story. It is a thrill and a pleasure to be able to speak with you tonight, sir. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to get started off the way I do with pretty much all of my guests, kind of tracing their artist journey. When did it first hit you that you wanted to be a storyteller? Were you a young man? Did something affect you? If you can think that far back, tell
Oh,
us the story.
yeah, it's moderately complex, but I'll condense. I'm one of those people that always wanted to be a storyteller of one
Mm,
kind or another. When I was a kid, before I could read and write, I told elaborate stories with toys. So it's always been there. It hasn't always been my day job, though. I mean, I went to college to study journalism, and I was a magazine feature writer for about 30 years, part time.
mm.
My job varied between I was a bouncer in a strip club. I was a bodyguard in the entertainment industry. I was a college teacher teaching martial arts history, women's self-defense, and jujitsu, and a bunch of other jobs along the way. And but it was all nonfiction. I had the vision of being a nonfiction writer, probably because I was in high school right after Watergate. So we all wanted to be either Woodward or Bernstein.
Right,
And
right.
but then in the early 2000s, I started writing my first non-martial arts related book. I had done about 20 martial arts books, including my first textbook, which was actually for my buddy's judo class. That was my very first published book. But in the early 2000s, I wrote a nonfiction book called The Vampire Slayer's Field Guide to the Undead, which was published under a pen name because my publisher, who had done all my martial arts books, was afraid that my readers would think here I am, a respected martial arts instructor,
Sure.
in the Martial Arts Hall of Fame and all that crap, and suddenly I'm writing about vampires and werewolves. So he wanted me to do it under a pen name. So that book came out under the name of Shane MacDougall. Uh,
That's a
Shane,
great one.
well, Shane is Scottish for John, and Mac,
Hmm.
one of the Scottish clans my family is descended from. We're mostly Guns and Stewarts, but also MacDougalls. And that worked out, but the writing of that got me so interested in folklore and folkloric monsters that I kept looking for them in novels and couldn't find them. This is early 2000s, I said. So my wife basically said, "Well, stop bitching about it and write the damn thing." So I did. So I spent a few years writing my first novel, and that came out in 2006. And
And
that was Ghost Story Blues.
Ghost Road
Um,
Blues, right.
and then since then, I've gone into I'm still doing nonfiction. I do short stories. I do comic books. I've done a lot of comic book work, Marvel, RDW, Dark Horse, other companies, and all sorts of things. But now that I've started writing novels, which first one came out when I was 48, now I'm 65, and I'm writing my 50th. I realize that's what I should have been doing all along.
You are an extremely prolific. How Tell me a bit about your schedule. I mean, you have to just be disciplined beyond belief. Do you punch in a certain time? Do you go for a word count every day?
A little bit of all of that. I mean, I got a lot of the discipline from martial arts. I've been doing that for 60
Yeah.
years. Also from studying journalism, because you don't have undisciplined reporters. You know, the editor wants you to, do 2,000 words on this by a certain time of day. You do it.
Mhm.
That's the job. So, I had that training. But also, I love when I realized that I loved fiction, I fell in love with it. So my schedule kind of works out like this. I'm usually in bed by 9:30 and I'm usually up at 5. And I go straight to the beach. I live right by the beach. Sit there in my car, especially when it's cold, or walk around when it's not, and meditate. I read some poetry every day before I write, but also I just kind of set my head for the day.
Hmm.
When I get home, say 7:30-ish, walk the dog and all that, I sit down to work, and I try to do 4,000 words a day, every day. You can't always, because sometimes you have a lot of business stuff to do. It's never a shortage of ideas; it's a shortage of hours in the day. And I don't let it become so obsessive that I'm working till midnight every night. So I knock
Mm.
off 5. That's dinner, and whatever family stuff's going on. But in that, I have to budget out my time, because I
Mm.
write a novel every 3 months, and I don't write short novels. And I write, like this year, I'm writing an unusually large number of short stories. About to start my 18th short story, and I'll start that tomorrow of this year. It'll be my 159th overall. But I edit Weird Tales magazine, so I have to budget time for that. I budget 5 to 10 minutes every hour for social media, and Plus, there's discussions with my agent, there's contract stuff, there's movie and TV stuff, there's editing to do. So there's a lot of stuff that comes in that is not just writing,
Sure.
but it has to fit into the workday. And
Right.
I run my creative job as a business. And when you want to be able to live off your business, you better be efficient at it. And
Yeah. So are
so
you
I
one of those lucky people that your both sides of your brain work? Like, is it hard for you to switch between the business and the art, or you can just one hand does one hand does the other? You can go all day just
yeah,
one by
I,
one.
I mean the business allows me, if I do the business right, I get to write more often. So, those things work well. And it's funny, when I first got into well, after I started writing mostly academic books, like college textbooks and so on, I had to deal with a small press, small publisher, and he had been a friend. He was a friend at the time, and instead of getting a contract, we had a handshake.
Mm.
That deal went bad, and so I never got paid, and I got things were horrible. I'm not going to name names.
Oh,
So what I did is I went out then and learned everything I could about the business side of things, because I didn't want to be at the mercy of someone who knew more about publishing than I did. And I found I liked the business side of it. It's its own set of challenges, its own set of rewards. And I like, I'm big on relationship building.
mm-hmm.
So, I don't want to just have an agent. I want to be a partner with my agent and my editor and, so on. And building those relationships, cultivating that takes time. I also am very, very active in community building for writers. That takes time. But the process allows me to be able to move within those different parts of my writing life fairly seamlessly. Sometimes you do need a break. Like, if I finish a long novel and I've just done a couple of days where I'm doing like sometimes when I'm at the end of a novel, my word count like spikes up. I'll do 10,000, 12,000 words in a day, and it'll turn me into a zombie.
Wow.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, because I like, if it's a fight scene or action scene, which usually at the end of my books, I can write that stuff faster than I can write other things. But then I need a break. So I may wind up, spending a day at the movies,
Mm.
or just doing something goofing off. Last couple of days, I've just been goofing off reading science magazines because I have to write a hard science fiction story. And so I've been going through trade journals and so on, coming up with ideas. And I found one that I really liked, and I'm going to be
Oh.
starting that.
Oh, I'll be on the lookout for that. Thinking back, and I know for me, like so much of what you're saying strikes me because first of all, from the Murphy clan. And second of all, the same thing, making elaborate stories with my toys. For me, it was Star Trek action figures. Some of your early influences, not just those toys, but I mean, feel free to go comics, films, novels. What were some of the early influences on you?
Well, I mean, in fact, you can see it right over my shoulder, my fingers pointing. First book I ever bought was Conan the Wanderer. The
Mm.
Bantam edition came out in 1966, I think. I was 8. Snatched it up, fell in love. I've been a fan of Conan ever since. Um, Shortly after that, I got into Edgar Rice Burroughs, read all the Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff. In fact, I just finished yesterday, 2 days ago, a John Carter of Mars Cthulhu story for an anthology coming up.
Now
Um,
that's fun.
yeah, and it's the second John Carter story I've done over the years. But uh, the influences, we had some great TV when I was a kid. I was born in the late 50s, grew up in the 60s. We had the Outer Limits, we had the reruns of Twilight Zone, we had Voyage to Bob Seed, Time Tunnel, Land of the Giants, all that stuff. And
Yeah.
I devoured every bit of it.
I was
Uh,
just talking to another writer, and I was talking about short work, and I was talking about Charles Beaumont and Richard Matheson, and they were looking at me like I was speaking a foreign language, and it's like,
yeah,
oh my God, what you have
well,
to discover.
let me tell you the other part of my my origin story. So this this is the wild part. The secretary, the middle school librarian, the librarian in the middle school I went to, terrible school in Philadelphia, but she was great. She was the secretary for 2 different clubs of professional writers. One that met in Philadelphia, and it was anchored by George Sithers and L. Sprague de Camp.
Oh,
L. Sprague de Camp being that guy, you know.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He was the one that they had a literary agent who had been representing the Robert E. Howard estate gave Sprague all of the unfinished Robert E. Howard manuscripts and said, "See if you can do something with them." And Sprague is the one that brought Conan back and expanded the story. So he was a lifelong mentor and friend. The other club, it was not so much a formal club as a kind of an ongoing cocktail party. And this is like 1970. So all books were launched in New York back then. There was no internet. You launched, if you were big enough, you launched a book back then. So she would take me up to New York. He got my parents, well, she actually got my grandmother to forge my father's signature so I could go on these trips. And the guys in that group, I mean, they weren't from New York. They were in New York for book launches, and they were very high output. So I got to know and be mentored by Ray Bradbury, Richard
Oh,
Matheson, Harlan Ellison, to a lesser degree, Arthur C. Clarke, and a few others. Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho. So Bradbury and Matheson became, really good friends to me as a kid. Like first, they grilled me to make sure I was serious about wanting to become a writer.
sure.
And every time I showed up and they were there, which was, I think Matheson was there 4 times a year, and Bradbury was there probably 3 times a year over a 3-year period. So it was enough times.
Hmm.
But they would bring me shopping bags of books, and
Oh, come
originally
on.
their own stuff, and then later on it was stuff they thought I should read. And
Mm.
like my librarian, they didn't always give me stuff that was in my zone. They would give me mysteries and thrillers and histories and nonfiction books on different subjects, just so that the idea, and Bradbury said this a dozen times, know more than you're taught. So you need to dig deeper, expand your own brain, deepen your knowledge, and so on. And it started there. And we got the last cover quotes from each of them for my novel, my first novel, which those are on the 10th anniversary edition. And
Special, special,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
I was lucky enough to meet Harlan when I lived in LA for a good while, and I was going to Dangerous Visions all the time and got to know him. And he actually gave me a tour of Harlan Ellison Wonderland. And I
yeah.
mean, and people have asked me, was he as cantankerous? And it's like, he was the nicest guy to meet.
He was. He was angry at people taking advantage of writers,
Absolutely.
and publishers. He wasn't angry at writers. In fact, if he saw you as a writer who genuinely was interested in his trade, in your trade, he was like Uncle Harlan.
Oh,
And
coat off his back, right?
yeah.
Absolutely. Anything for
Uh,
him.
and in fact, for those who don't know Harlan, if you look up Harlan Ellison and um, rant on YouTube, you get this brilliant rant where he's talking about why writers should get paid.
Yeah.
With my favorite quotable line is, "I don't take a piss unless I get paid." And see, I apply that to my own field. I'm a mercenary.
Yeah.
I'm a creative, but pay me.
You should get that stitched on a pillow, my friend. He wasn't wrong. And I had met him in later in life, and his wife would not allow him to get chili dogs from Pink's, and he would sneak down to DV Dangerous Visions, which he was co-owner of at the time, and I would run down the street and get him chili dogs. So he was always crazy nice to me.
Yeah, he was a great guy. And
Oh
that's the thing is, a lot of these guys I met, even Arthur Clarke, who was a little odd, was still a really nice guy. But
yeah,
the two that I bonded closest with were Bradbury and Matheson. And oh my God, uh, two completely different types of writers, but two writers who understood not only their craft, but their process and the business.
yeah.
And that was foundational and of unbelievable value from a poor kid from the inner cities of Philadelphia who had no expectation of ever meeting someone like that or being mentored by them, it's so generously.
Wow, what an amazing origin story. Now, your first trilogy that came out, the Pine Deep trilogy,
Mhm.
and you had come to this later after journalism and all your time in the martial arts, and you had I do the elevator pitch for me, because I have the hardest time doing elevator pitch for your material, because it's such a love letter to everything of the genre, and
Well,
I have a hard time summing it up.
the quick pitch on Pine Deep is a town that celebrates Halloween as the center of its tourism. They have everything Halloween, Halloween fairs, they have parades, all the craft stores are Halloween, and their motto is we're the most haunted town in America.
That's right.
But it turns out they are the most haunted town in America, and that is not going to be a good thing for the people who live there or the tourists who visit. Pine Deep, it's a town where every bad thing can happen because there is both positive and negative energy, and the negative energy is stronger.
Mm.
So it brings out the worst in you, and whether you're human or not.
And seeped into that town through history, years and years and years of the bad energy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
So
I've been returning to Pine Deep since the trilogy came out. So
I'm aware. I'm aware. You've got the whole Mayberry verse. We're going to get into it a little bit. What was that like for you to come out, for you to get struck by I want to tell stories, all the way going back to working with your toys, and now it's the
Yep.
early 2000s, and you get the Bram Stoker Award for best first novel. I mean, does that just wipe away any pretender syndrome that you could have had? What was that moment like?
Well, I want to answer your second question first. No, it does not remove imposter syndrome at all. I was on panels with um, Dean Koontz and Stephen King and Anne Rice and Charlene Harris, all of us talking about imposter syndrome that we get now.
Yeah.
It never goes away, and I'm not sure it should. I think imposter syndrome kind of keeps you honest, keeps you from just mailing something in. But the process of getting there was weird because I had never, I went to school for journalism. I never took a creative writing class. So I had to teach myself how to write fiction, and I had to study the form. I got 6 novels that I absolutely loved that were in my specific subgenre, which is urban gothic or rural horror, a couple small town horror. I read them as a reader, and then reread them like over and over again as a writer, looking for the elements of craft that I found in various books on the craft of fiction. Figurative language, metaphor, motif, all these things. And I went through and looked for how each of them used them and how they use them differently, how they use them uniquely to themselves. Not to copy their form, but to understand how these elements are used correctly by people who understand the process and the form. And it took me 3.5 years to write the first book.
Mm.
And I did it kind of to get it out of my system. I had no expectation of becoming a novelist by trade. I didn't think the thing would sell. I just
Really?
wanted to write it. I wanted to write the book, to quote Ray Bradbury. He said, "Don't just write the book you would want to read. Write the book you would go out of your way to hunt down and read." So I wrote that, the folklore and the complex characters and martial arts and a lot of cathartic elements. And I just wrote a book that I really would want to, fall in love with. And when it was done, I kind of said, this, maybe it will get an agent. So I cooked up a really good query letter, and I sent out, I researched who represented the 10 top writers in my field, and I sent those agents letters. I had gotten bad advice. People said I should shoot for a low-level agent because they're the only ones willing to take a flyer on a new writer.
Mm.
And having written a lot of nonfiction doesn't do squat for you when you're writing fiction. But I figured Audacity seems like a better play.
Yeah.
I shot high, and I got 6 of the 10 asked to see their full or partial manuscripts, and 4 gave me offers of representation. The one I picked, Sarah Crow, is the one who, when talking with her, was very clear that I didn't need to stay in a lane, because I told her, I said, I'm much more like Richard Matheson than Bradbury in that if you look at Matheson's work, like no 2 of those books are on the same shelf.
Oh no.
I Am Legend, Somewhere in Time, Stir of Echoes, Shrinking Man, What Dreams May Come. I mean, he's all over the damn place.
Yeah.
And he wrote the books he most loved and then sold them. He got his agent to sell them. And she said, "You write it, I'll pitch it." And we have pitched a lot. I mean, between novels, nonfiction books, short story collections, anthologies, comics and graphic novels, a board game, and other stuff, she is
Okay.
she's closed 133 deals for me.
And still your agent to this day.
Oh yeah, yeah. In fact, she's moved from a couple different agencies. She now has her own agency, and I've moved with her. And I was her first big client, and I think I'm still her biggest client. Certainly the one who keeps her the busiest, because I always have at least a dozen projects going on at any one time.
Let me tap you on this now. You brought up, and we brought up a couple times, coming from the journalistic background. And this, I really want to ask you about this because in the Joe Ledger series, and again, I want you to do the elevator pitch for me because you did it back and forth on Twitter with me because I can never do the elevator pitch for this series because it has so many elements of so many things. But the importance of research, you are able to suspend my disbelief like no one else because of the time spent in research. Go a little bit into the importance of
Sure.
that for you.
Well, I'm a research junkie, and I'm a science junkie for sure, plus also history and so on. A lot of writers are. That's why it's terrible to sit next to us while watching Jeopardy. We spoil it for everyone. But when I was doing my Well, the research I'd done for my first three novels, the Pine Deep trilogy, was all, the research I did for that nonfiction book.
Right.
Folkloric monsters and how they're different from ordinary, the ones we see in books and movies. But when I started doing Patient Zero, my fourth novel, I wanted to do a zombie novel because I wanted a
Mm.
horror novel that was going to transition from straight horror to weird science thriller. So I wanted a kind of a gateway drug for that. And but I didn't want to do the standard thing where we don't know how it starts or it's an unknown virus with no thing. I wanted to actually the like little backstory. I snuck into the movies at age 10 to see Night of the Living Dead's premiere. So
At
I've been
age
with
10.
yeah, October 2nd, 1968, Midway Theater in Philadelphia. So I've been with the zombie thing all along. And much as I loved the movie, the whole thing about radiation from a space probe possibly causing it makes no scientific sense.
Thin.
I
It's
mean,
thin.
not only not it's impossible.
Yeah.
There's nothing about radiation that would cause that. But there are parasites that might, there are prion diseases that might, there are other things that might, especially if they've been weaponized. So I started reaching out for experts in different fields. I would look for articles, like I would say, prion disease, expert controversy. Put those three words in a Google search. It'll pull up articles where they're talking about that and they're talking to some expert. Well, all experts in these articles and news articles, they always give their credentials. So you do a search. And I
Mm.
found out which organization they were with, which university, or whether it's DARPA or whatever they're working with. They all have contact pages. And I just reached out and said, look, I'm doing on this subject. Can I tap you for some information? Because I want to get your field of this, part of this field right. And they're very happy when you want to get their stuff right.
Yeah.
In every one of my books, I have an acknowledgments block that lists all these experts.
Oh, your acknowledgement pages are the best. I mean, it's not just a regular host of characters that help a literary figure out. I mean, whether it's, prions, germ warfare, AI. I mean,
Yeah.
pick a sky is falling scenario. You will make me scared to leave my house every time because it's so unbelievably realistic.
Well, there's a trick to that. There's kind of a secret to how that works. There's an old con man expression that goes, use 9 truths to sell one lie.
One lie.
So if you build your story on a foundation of stuff that if they go look it up on the net, it's there. They'll find it. And plus also asking experts like, what are some things I don't even know enough about your field to even ask, and I put that stuff in there. Or what's the coolest, weirdest, newest thing happening in your field right now? And they'll tell you that because it hasn't reached the press yet. But by the time the book comes out, that'll be in the news. You look
Mhm.
very appreciative. And like, and what should I have asked you and not, and I didn't. And they would talk, and I would use all that, and I would build it on the scaffold of real science. So when I take that leap, it isn't like, all right, you can see where the science ends. This would, I start throwing in little elements of the fiction. So it's difficult to find where I jump into that leap of faith, that the suspension of disbelief that I asked my readers to have. And the more hard science that's in there, the more believable and the scarier the fiction is. Like I was doing one on volcanology. I did stuff on drones and GPS hacking and AI, and you know and now some of the scientists that I've worked with have wound up in my Joe Ledger series. In fact,
Yeah.
John Smar was in quite a few of them, and there's a guy, Ronald Coleman. He's a friend of mine here. He's a molecular biologist. Was in college by the time he was 12.
Oh my God.
Yeah, super genius. Also pop culture nerd. I met him doing a panel. The two of us were on a panel with a virologist and with Kevin Eastman, the artist who co-created Ninja Turtles. It's a great panel.
That's an eclectic group. Yeah.
Yeah, we're all San Diegans too. So but uh, and then what happens a lot after you use some of these scientists, you'll start getting emails saying, "Hey, this is breaking in our field." Like I had an email from John Smar, the fact, a while back, and he said, there's something new. It's about to hit the United States. It's called Zika. It's nasty. It's horrible. You should use it." And I did. And by the time that book came out, Zika was in the news.
Mm-hmm.
Guys who were in the front lines of this stuff know it.
Mm-hmm.
Ronald Coleman is now an ongoing character in the Joe Ledger series. Plus, I had him killed off by a werewolf in one of my in an Audible original I did.
I'm sure he was happy about that.
Yeah, oh yeah,
The other thing that I'm able to tie myself to so readily in so much of your work is like where you started with the the cultural background of different parts of the world, and where we have a touchstone of our gestalt of what we've grown up hearing over and over again in our tall tale legends, those kind of things. And that's another just, quick hit for me that just sucks you right in.
yeah, and like I said, I'm a research junkie. So if I want to do something with an urban legend, I'll read about urban legends, and I'll find out. Like I'm pitching a Jersey Devil novel,
Mm,
early next to 2024, an urban legend from where I grew up. I grew up in Philadelphia, right across the road, the river from New Jersey. Um, and there are people who are experts on everything.
yeah.
So I find out what the experts think, and then I build my story around that. But research is king.
Mm.
One of the tricks, though, is not putting all the research in the book, because the book would become a textbook rather than a novel.
You got to walk that tightrope, right?
Yeah, so I tend to overwrite and then scale back.
Uh,
Because sometimes you don't know which part of the science is going to matter until you've done the whole book, and you realize, well, I only use this, and this, and these things are referenced, but they're not in the book and might just be distracting. So maybe I'll cut those out. It's like conversation. You have a dialogue section going for a long time, but in revision, maybe this part of it is key, but the rest help you get into those characters. In revision, you just you know dial down to what the reader needs to know.
yeah.
So revision is a to me revision is a part of writing. It's not just it's people think of it as editing. I'm thinking of refining the writing.
Exact. There's another that one of the sharpest tools in your box that I enjoy time and time again. And another writer, and I know you appreciate this writer as well, the Mucho Mojo storyteller himself, Joe R. Lansdale. You guys, when you guys write a fight scene, you know what it's like to lay hands on somebody, and you guys can write, you particularly, sir, can write a fight scene like no one else. They're never the same. They're always brutal. They're always quick. They're always it's just outstanding. Can you do a little bit of how you get your background of martial arts onto the page?
Well, one little side note before I get into that is Joe Lansdale is a good friend of mine, and
Mm-hmm.
he just wrote the introduction for a short story collection that's coming out next September. And he's also a martial artist.
Oh,
And
yeah, absolutely.
so my approach to it, um, I not only taught martial arts, I taught martial arts history. And I taught it from the point of view of not just the cultural elements, but the physics, the physiology, and the anatomy, the psychology, and the law. Because that you need to know that if you're going to be fighting for real on the street. Because if you don't know that, you're going to wind up in jail, even if you defend yourself. And I've always been a scholar wanting to know deeply. And the style of jiu-jitsu I studied, the old Japanese style, we were required to know the history and the anatomy and so on. Like our black belt test, for example, first degree black belt test, 2.5 weeks long. Written
Wow.
tests, oral tests, endless physical tests. And one of the things that I learned, and one of the things that I later taught when I was teaching women's self-defense for 35 years, is that no two fights are the same, and no fight is ever predictable. It's kind of like that military expression, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Well, you can train all you want in the dojo, but when you get out in the street, the situation's always going to be unique. So you need to train for the adaptation and response, not the prediction. So when I'm constructing a fight scene, I want to choreograph like if I'm doing a scene where like there was one where Joe Ledger is at his ex-girlfriend's brave cemetery plot, and a couple of guys come up and get up in his face and want to start a fight. Well, the thing you need to make decisions because every fight can't be the same. These are three guys who are Secret Service agents told to pick him up, so he needs to defend himself, but he can't really hurt them much.
Sure. Yeah.
Go to federal prison. Also, if they have a warrant, they have a legal right. He just doesn't want to be caught. So he also has to figure out how to control the situation and get the hell out of there. So you start building the factors, then you look at the land around you, like what is available. One of the sub-sciences in jiu-jitsu that not taught in most jiu-jitsu styles, weirdly, something called Hidaka Kodosu. It's the use of commonplace objects as weapons. So you could have a towel around your neck. Well, it's a deadly weapon used correctly. You could have a McDonald's drinking straw, you can kill somebody with that thing if you know how. So if it's all, again, physics, you fold a drinking straw in half and pinch it so there's only a corner of it sticking out. Try do that sometime and peel an orange. You'll be surprised at how sharp and deep you can cut. um, and also, you have to think about, like, what are they wearing?
Mm.
What's the weather? Is it raining? Is it snowing? Is it sunny? Are they wearing restrictive clothing? Are they? Or if it's the woman character, is she in heels? Is she wearing a skirt that doesn't allow her to do a lot of kicking or running? Once you build all those things in, then you can construct the fight scene, and you make that fight scene um, as realistic as possible. When people start doing stuff that no sane fighter would do, then you edit it out, or you don't put it in. Like I mentioned before that I was a bodyguard and I was a bouncer, so I've had hundreds and hundreds of fights. Like the club I was a bouncer for was one of those clubs where we were fighting nearly every night,
Wow.
and sometimes two and three guys, and you've got to win. There's no plan B.
Right.
And when I was a bodyguard, you're protecting. I was working in the entertainment industry. You're protecting someone who's being stalked, and our company was only hired when there was a specific, credible threat. So it wasn't just an entourage guard. We were there while the police were looking for whoever was after them. And sometimes these guys get right up in us. And like I've got scars on my forearm. I got chopped in the shoulder with a meat cleaver once. That's no fun.
Yikes.
Stabbed in the stomach with an ice pick, et cetera, et cetera. Um, in fact, I have a scar on my forehead from a carpet knife. And you still got to fight. Well, not with the meat cleaver in the shoulder. I kind of collapsed and did my best to bleed out.
Yeah, I would tap out of that one.
Yeah, my partner was behind me. He resolved the situation. But you know, like the scar on my forearm, I don't know if you can see it right there.
Yep.
That's a razor cut, right? You get cut, you're in pain, blood's going everywhere. You get that while pushing your protectee into a car out of the way, and then you've got to fight the guy who's still armed while you're now injured. So that's one of the reasons Joe Ledger often, I often write fights where even though he's the best fighter you're going to meet, he may be or outnumbered, or one book he was naked in the shower and he got attacked by a bunch of guys. You try to think of what resources does he have and who wants to win that fight more, because that often plays into it.
Yeah.
I have, when I was competing, I was a boxer. I boxed Golden Gloves. I wrestled all state, and I was in 106 full contact matches, kickboxing matches, with a score of 102 wins, two losses, two ties. Those 102 times I won, I wanted it more than the other guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was willing to get hurt to win it.
What I love about a Ledger fight is what also factors in is, of course, he is the best fighter that you're going to come across. But where is he psychologically at that moment? What has he been through? How frosty is he at that moment? Because that can weigh on him as well. And I love how expedient he is. He's never showy. He wants to end the fight as quickly as possible. And that just seems so realistic to me.
Well, it is. I mean, I used to train cops, and I trained special forces in hand-to-hand combat of different types. These guys do not have time to waste, and they're not trying to impress the audience. They need to win the moment and keep going. And sometimes it gets very brutal, but also there are times when you need to win the moment, and you have to stay in the situation. Like maybe you're protecting someone, or maybe the person you're fighting is out of their mind, but not a bad person. So you have to adjust. You have to still win the fight, but you have to adjust how much damage you're willing to do. And that can actually create vulnerabilities, which in stories is dramatic tension.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Some of my favorite moments in Ledger, and I am caught up with the series at this point. One of my favorite moments is when the Lovecraftian mythos sneaks in there. Now, I'm going to tee you up for this story, Mr. Maberry, because I've heard you tell it before, but for those that haven't, I believe at Comic-Con, how did this come up? I absolutely love this.
Okay, so I have been a Lovecraft fan since I was a kid, but the way this happens, before my editor had a couple of little kids, this is prior to COVID and so on. Every year he would come out to San Diego Comic-Con, and we'd walk around. He's a pop culture nerd too. We'd walk around, and at some point he would say, "So, what's the next Ledger book going to be?" And as a joke, a total joke, because I had no intention of doing this, I said, "Joe Ledger versus Cthulhu." We had just actually passed a stall, whatever, selling Cthulhu stuff. I said it as a joke and expected a laugh and move on. He turns to me and goes, "That's awesome." And I'm like, wait. I was not serious. He's like, "Oh my God, I need that book. That is the book you're going to write for me." I'm like, okay. So I put Cthulhu in the book Kill Switch, I think it was. And since then, I've put Lovecraftian elements in a lot of my stories.
Yeah.
And part of that is because I edit Weird Tales magazine now. So
I think it seeps in. It seeps in, right? But I just love that. It almost came up like a double dog dare, and I just thought it was great. All the Easter eggs in there, and it was just one of the most action packed. I absolutely loved it.
yeah. Now, by the way, to give the elevator pitch on Ledger for the folks who may not
Yes,
know.
please do.
So Joe Ledger was a Army Ranger, then a Baltimore police detective, and then he was kind of hired into a special ops group that went up against terrorists who were using a cutting edge weird science weapons. The reason he is so effective at this, because psychologically speaking, he is as crazy as a bag of hamsters. The reason he's so good at this is because he had gone through terrible, terrible childhood trauma and had been unable to protect his girlfriend when they were both attacked. And he could not bear the idea that no matter what he did, he was just unprepared. I mean, older teens beat him nearly to death. So he used martial arts to rebuild himself, but at the same time, the assault on her and her later suicide fractured him psychologically. And with a lot of people talk about multiple personality disorders, which is a umbrella term that doesn't really fit all the iterations of that. There are types of damage where somebody can develop or manifest several different personality types and is aware of them. It's not like schizophrenia where you become a completely different person. They're aware of them and can even negotiate with them. It's almost like having your own group therapy session in your head. And the psychiatrist who worked with him, Rudy Sanchez, helped him slim down the number of them and then to cultivate the individuals who were left. And one was the modern man, who was probably the version of Joe who would have grown up had he not been attacked. Part of him was the cop, which also includes the soldier and the spec ops guy, the problem solver who uses logic and knowledge. And then the other part is the hunter, the warrior, or the killer, depending on what mood Joe's in when he's talking about him. And that is the damaged warrior within him who is extremely violent, but will never hurt the innocent. He is violent against the bad guys.
Yeah.
And he's the one who will likely go to war under a black flag if there is no way of resolving the situation. And I know that part really well because that childhood trauma Joe went through, I went through. The difference is I was already in martial arts and I wasn't there. I found her after.
I had no idea about that.
And I did find the guys, um, and wound up getting arrested because cops came up and I was beating the crap out of these three guys, and the cops thought I was the bad guy and they wailed on me quite a bit. Later found
Wow.
out not, but see, I had already been in martial arts by then. I'd started when I was 6, and this happened when I was 14, and that kept me straight, kept me balanced. It had so much structure around me. Because also, I grew up as an abused kid at home. My father was a monster. In fact, Vic Wingate from the Pine Deep books is based on my father.
I did not know that. Wow.
Novels are into catharsis.
Yeah.
So the difference in Joe and I is I already had the structure, and that saved me. Joe didn't, and it broke, but the structure helped him refine that part of him. And he has a talent that is particularly rare, except in groups like Delta Force. Zero hesitation. It's a very
Yes.
rare and very real concept. And if you have zero hesitation, if something happens and you react, you are the one going to survive the moment. You have the best chance of surviving the moment. And you can't teach it to anyone. You either have it or you don't. And I have a bit of it myself. When crisis happens, I'm the person who's not going to panic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm more likely to get upset if my dog is sick rather than if shit's happening.
Or someone of your family or something. I would rather take that pain on as opposed to see it
Oh yeah, because
outside.
I'm
Yeah.
very very used to pain and injuries. I've had 27 surgeries to repair damage from my old professions, and I'm allergic to painkillers. So I've felt every moment of all that pain.
Wow.
But
That's fast.
you
That
develop a stoicism. you know.
Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating to me because psychological trauma of one kind or another is so prevalent in the Ledger series and in another of your work as well. But I mean, not only like that fractured persona that you described so well of this character that is in this super secret SEAL Team 6 level team taking on everything that goes bump in the night, techno thriller kind of thing, but also the PTSD from those that will stand up and draw a line and say, no further, or um, the grief that they carry from this job. All of these things are dealt with in this series.
Yeah, and again, on a personal note, my brother had served a couple of tours in Nam, and saw was all his buddies from his neighborhood. They all went together and they all died except for him.
Wow.
And he got into drugs and other things. He kept going back to Vietnam because he had this idea he would find them.
Oh,
And so PTSD was with him his entire life. And last year he killed himself, unfortunately.
oh my God, I'm so sorry.
So I actually wrote about that too.
Hmm.
It's, you know, a writer should not be afraid to take the things that are painful in their lives and write about them. Because if you don't, they're always there and they're like waiting to punch you. But if you write about them, you take some agency over the events. You give, in a way, a better third act than real life actually has, and that gives you control.
And you share it. You share it. I mean, now that pain can be realized and shared, and we can all learn something a little bit about ourselves through the sharing.
Yeah, like with Pine Deep stories, I've heard from so many people who were very badly abused, like like the Crow character talking about his childhood, and Mike Sweeney with what's going on in the story. And there are a lot of people who say, they've never read an accurate depiction of what it's like to be an abused child. I was an abused child. My four sisters were abused. We had a monster of a father, and as a result, I'm able to write about that with a sense of realism. And I don't believe in sugarcoating it,
No, you do not.
because danger lies in deception. So if I'm going to say that, oh, it's not that bad, or don't want to put it in the book, then there are some people who won't understand how bad that sort of thing is, but the other thing is they won't feel seen. And if there's something they relate to, they feel seen. In fact, it's funny, in the Joe Ledger novel I'm writing now, aside from the main story, after the events of the last book, which were pretty traumatic for most of the characters, I include transcripts of Rudy Sanchez's therapy sessions with Mr. Church, Top, Bunny, and Joe. So I'm actually getting the therapy sessions that only Rudy would know, and I'm sharing them with the audience. And
No, that's great. Okay,
that's a lot of fun.
this tees up my next question because let's talk about this one now. I just put my list out on the channel of books that I am highly anticipating for 2024, and you, Mr. Maberry, show up two times on that list. And one of them is The Alchemist. Now, I think I read or I remember
That's
you saying,
2025. That's
is
2025,
that
kid.
oh no, I have to wait another year. So
2024 is Burn to Shine.
I remember, oh, Burn to Shine. Oh, I thought it was The Alchemist. I remember reading or you saying that the enigmatic Mr. Church will always remain a mystery. Now, The Alchemist, you are going to peel back the curtain and we are going to get the backstory. What made you change your mind?
Well, in my discussions with my editor, for a while, the only person who had guessed who Mr. Church was Ray Porter, my audiobook reader, who's genius and he's a great guy, smart. And my editor said, "Are you ever going to tell the story?" And I said, "Probably not." And he said, "But we agreed that if 250 people figured out who Joe Ledger is, figured out who Mr. Church is, I would tell the story." And we're now well over 400. Um,
Really?
yeah, and a lot of people guess wrong because they think he's based on a supernatural character. He's based on a real person. A bit mysterious, but a real person. And his real name, has been mentioned in the books already. And the novel Rage has the best clues. Most people figured it out from that book on. So I decided to tell the story, and I've been dropping some hints here and there. And I want to have the story that fun with it, and also some flashback stuff to when Mr. Church and Aunt Sally were a team, kind of like the Avengers from the John Steed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
They were that in the '60s for the CIA.
Oh,
But
I
Mr. Church has been fighting his war for quite a long time,
okay. You're making me want to go back and reread Rage. I'll tell you that right now.
and
Let,
one other thing, real quick, with it
yeah.
is the book that is coming out next year, Burn to Shine. Um, if you read Code Zero, you know the phrase "burn to shine," so you know who's probably coming back.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
And
I've been expecting that.
yeah, so she is going to be partnered up with Nicodemus, and most of the story is going to be set in Pine Deep. So
Oh,
I'll
you're
have,
kidding me.
yeah, I'll have Church. Oh, and I'll have Crow. I'll have Mike Sweeney. I'll have Monk Addison in it. That's the main character from Inc., which is my fourth Pine Deep novel, and it's going to be a big, rollicking mess of a story. I'm having so much fun. I'm about a third of the way through it.
Oh, so it's the whole Mayberry verse comes together. Ink
A
and
lot.
Glimpse are two I'm behind now. I haven't read those two, so no spoilers.
Inc. is my favorite novel we've ever written.
Oh
Uh,
wow. Okay.
and it is both of those novels have Monk Addison in them.
Yeah.
And Monk is a character I introduced in short stories. In fact, I just turned in the complete collection of Monk Addison short stories that will be published next December, called Mystic, the Monk Addison Case Files. And there's a story in the new Joe Ledger anthology, Joe Ledger Unbreakable, where Joe and Monk team up against human traffickers. Monk is tied with Joe as my favorite character.
Yeah. Monk is a bad man. Let me segue something real quick. I don't want to run out of time before I hit you up on this. I want to talk to
Plenty
you
of
a little
time.
bit about guest stars in your books. I don't want to ruin anything now. I don't want, if for anyone that hasn't gotten to the past two Ledger books, but now there's a couple good old boys that I recognize and love from another series that I love. And then there's a certain repairman from New York that I absolutely adore from a different series. Tell me, I mean, is it just you getting together with friends and asking permission? Like, how does this come about?
Well, I started doing it earlier on when when Church or Joe would talk about other teams that were actively involved in the same kind of work they're doing. So I would name check SEAL Team 666 by Wes Oakes, who sadly died a month ago today.
Oh,
Uh, uh, James Rollins, Sigma Force, Jeremy Robinson's chess team, and so on. But all of those guys are buddies of mine.
right.
So I would call them up, or Larry Correa's SEAL Teams, Larry Correa's Monster Hunter International. Not call up and say, "Hey, I want to name check such and such a character in Ledger book." And they're like, "Yeah, cool." With Larry, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his fiction.
I haven't read any of Larry Correa, but
It's
he's
pretty
on my list.
yeah, it's pretty wild stuff too. And it's interesting because he and I are completely on opposite sides of the political fence, but we can have a reasoned conversation. And that's something missing in America right now. That people
Absolutely.
have different opinions to be able to understand one another. And we don't have to agree, but we can see where they're coming from. Anyway, so his Monster Hunter International series is hugely successful. I mean, the New York Times bestsellers and all that. And there was an opportunity once we were asked to do an anthology called Urban Allies, edited by Jonas Cease. And they were asking writers to pair up with other writers. And I had been on a million panels with Larry, and I said, why don't we take your Agent Frank's character, who's basically Frankenstein, as a spec ops guy, great concept, and my Joe Ledger, and put him in the same story. And we did that, and then each of us did anthologies of our characters. So I did an Agent Frank story for his Monster Hunter anthology. He did a story, I think, with was it Rudy or I think he might have done one about Rudy in mine. And so Agent Franks has shown up a couple times, but more recently, I decided to give the cameos a bigger play. So with Relentless, I talked to a friend of mine, and he knows what a fan. I've been a fan of his since long before I became a friend of his, but we are very, very tight friends. And I said, I would like to put these guys in Relentless. He goes, oh hell yes. So it wasn't even a conversation. And then I talked to another buddy of mine who there are stories of us, David Morrell and Greg Hurwitz, partying in Louisiana, New Orleans, that will probably never be told in public. But let's just say that we have history. And I asked him if I could use his character, and he's like, sure. So now I've got in the new book, I can talk about this because it's been out in the thing already. Richard Cadre's Sandman Slim is going to appear in the new book. And there's a very, very good chance either this book or the next one, Laurel Hamilton's Anita Blake, Vampire Hunter, will be in it. And it's fun
Man,
because we're all friends, and
yeah.
it's fun to have them all this stuff happening in different corners of the same world.
I just absolutely no. There's one more guest star I have to ask about. Now,
Sure.
this is in your dead work, right? Tom Segura shows up. Did you talk to Tom Segura to get permission for to
Tom won
use?
a contest to be in that book. I did a contest for when Dead of Night came out, which was George Romero's favorite zombie novel.
We will get to that. Yeah.
Basis for us becoming friends. But in the second book, when I was planning to do the second book, I started a contest and said, if you can tell me how you would like to die in a zombie apocalypse, I'll pick a handful of winners and they'll go in the book. And Tom Segura, I had seen him. I met him for the first time in Orlando. I'd gone to see a comedy show, and he wasn't a tenth as big as he is now.
Oh, it's huge now. Yeah.
And in fact, the guy who opened for him is also in that book too. And so, but I talked to Tommy after the show, and I bought a CD, and we just chatting, and he was fascinated by the fact that I was a novelist, and we got talking. And I said, "Well, I'm doing this contest," and and he said, "Cool." So he started following me, saw the contest. He said, I wrote in that he would like to die doing stand-up comedy. So I wrote him in to Fall of Night. And for a while, when he would do stand-up, he would talk about the book that hey, zombies ate me, man. You know, and he's great. I love that his career is blowing up so much. He's huge now.
Oh, he's hilarious. He's hilarious.
Terrific,
I
terrific guy.
I knew there had to be a backstory to that. Let me segue a little bit, and I know this is important to you as well. And this is some of you hit on it a little bit before about spreading out into the community and teaching. And talk to me a little bit about in the Dead series, working with one of your students, Miss Rachel Lavin. What was that like, being able to work with a student and see her spread her wings like that?
Yeah, well, Rachel had been one of my best students. I used to teach a class called Experimental Writing for Teens, where each couple of weeks we take a different genre of writing. I would explain the genre, and I would give them in-class writing exercises that we would then read in class. And she was great. She was fantastic. And then, she's now an adult. She's married and everything. But when she was, I guess, in her early 20s, I think it was 24 maybe, I wanted to do, I had a little backup. In one of my Rotten Ruin books, the fifth book in my Rotten Ruin series, fifth of seven, uh, I based a character on her because she was really cool. She was a cosplayer, and
Mm-hmm.
she had a cosplay team as like dressed up as the Avengers or whoever would go to like children's cancer hospitals and so on, and do skits and lines from the show as entertainment for the kids. And that was such a good thing to do. So I wrote a story about a bunch of cosplayers who wound up surviving the zombie apocalypse by playing the characters that they loved. And so when I had a chance to do a prequel, the Fall of Dead of Night series is a prequel to Rotten Ruin, I wanted to give her origin story and so we wrote it together. Well, I did the Joe Ledger storyline. She did the Rachel L storyline, and they dovetailed together. And it was her first published work, and she did a great job with it. We had a lot of fun with it. And then when I wanted to do another one, I asked her if she would want to jump in. Jumped in. We did another one. I don't know if we'll do a fifth in that series, but if so, I'll probably bring her back in again. But it's always wonderful when your students not only get into professional sales, but do it at an earlier age than I did, and so that gives them a career ahead of them.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I had started when I was her age, started
Yeah.
fiction.
So working in the zombie world, how much of a bucket list was it to work with George Romero? You had snuck in that movie at 10, and now writing the apocalypse and writing it to where I'm telling you, you would fully believe it with your journalistic research. So you approach George Romero to pick up the story here.
All
What
right.
is that like?
So the first time I met George, we were on a panel together. I don't know, I forget what convention it was. I do a million, he did a million. So we were on a bunch of panels. And I was giving, the question was, how would you solve this if you were in a zombie apocalypse? And I am very much a problem solver, logical guy. So I would give answers. And George sitting next to me says, shit, I wish I thought about that when I was doing Dawn of the Dead. And he said a couple of things like that. And after the thing, he said, want to go get a beer? Because I really loved what you were saying. Let's just sit and talk. And we talked about zombies for about 25, 30 minutes. And then we just talked about everything else.
Yeah.
Every time I'd see him, we'd go out. And then, so I was writing, having done, the Joe Ledger Patient Zero, which was a zombie book, and I was writing Rotten Ruin. I had written Rotten Ruin books. I was getting known as a zombie author. And I didn't know that he had been reading my books because we had met. And I had dedicated a Dead of Night to him. And when I saw him again, I think it was at San Diego Comic-Con, he said, I read that Dead of Night, and I really appreciate you, dedicating to me. He said, that is how the zombie apocalypse should have happened in Night of the Living Dead. And I said, wow, that's like
Yeah.
one of the compliments. Roll forward a year later, and I thought, well, I'd like to do an anthology of stories set around Night of the Living Dead and like the 72 hours around it. And I knew that because of copyright mishap, Night of the Living Dead is public domain, but I didn't want to do it without his permission, without his blessing. So I called him up and I said, George, this is what I want to do. Can you give me your blessing? And he said, all right, on 3 conditions. I'm like, oh shit. He said, first, I want to co-edit it with you. And I did not see that coming.
Yeah.
And like, yes. And then he said, I also want to write a short story for it. I'm like, yes. And the third, he said, I love Dead of Night. I read Fall of Night, and you killed off my favorite character, but you didn't show him getting killed off. So I want you to take Sam Amora from the end of Fall of Night and write a story for that anthology, our anthology, and bring him to the house in Night of the Living Dead. So it is officially a prequel to Night of the Living Dead. And I may have ugly cried. Luckily, I was on the phone.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I did.
There were big man tears, right? There had to be big man tears at this point.
There were manly tears.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that made Dead of Night a prequel, and it made Rotten Ruin a sequel.
Yeah.
And that's what George and I were talking about. Unfortunately, in the days leading up to his death, the book had just come out. The anthologies came out. And we had, by the way, stories, Isaac Marion, who did Warm Bodies, and Brian Keene, and like the guy who wrote Girl with All the Gifts. I mean, all these people were in it. Sean McGuire, and the guy who created Z Nation. It was really great lineup. And shortly before his death, he said, now that the book is doing well, we should sit down and write a novel that is between Fall of Night and Night of the Living Dead. And I said, that's a great idea. And he said, well, I'll talk to my agent on Tuesday. Well, that conversation was on a Thursday, and I was doing a signing on Saturday, and his wife called me to say he died.
Oh.
So there is no paperwork, and there is no, they hired Daniel Kraus to do the origin story, and he did a great job. And I like Daniel. He's a cool guy. The book did really well. God bless, but I would have liked to have done that story with George, co-writing it with George. That would have what we're talking about. And but George will always be remembered. How many people actually get to create an entire genre?
I was just gonna say, not like make an imprint or change a genre, but literally create, right? Yeah.
Yep. And plus, George was the nicest guy in the world. I got a kind of a funny story about George, real quick. So he would call up, we just, talk, goofy stuff, whatever. We stopped talking about zombies long ago. We were talking about everything. And he said, look, there's a show I really love, but nobody believes that I really love it. And I need a buddy of mine I can talk to about the show. And I'm thinking, okay. And he says, it's a reality competition show. And I'm thinking, Face Off, that seemed the most reasonable, right?
Mm-hmm.
I said, is it Face Off? He said, no, it's Project Runway. And I'm like, what? He was obsessed with Project Runway. So every week he would be home and I'd be home and we'd watch it, and then we'd get on the phone and argue about who should have been sent home and who wasn't. I'm still hooked on the damn show. My wife and I got hooked on it, and now we're still watching the damn thing.
That is not.
If you were to make a list of 1,000 shows, Project Runway wouldn't be on that list.
It wouldn't have made my list at all. At all.
But that, shows he's, people are complex. He doesn't sit, like Stephen King doesn't sit around thinking about creepy shit all the time. He thinks about blues and baseball. He's an ordinary guy. Everybody's an ordinary guy,
Well, you would know more than me about Stephen King, but I'll take your word for it.
He's an ordinary guy, and he's funny.
Let me ask you, thinking of Stephen King, now he's got a big shared universe. You have a big shared universe, but I think you have a secret that people that do shared universe, and I'm particularly thinking of Marvel and DC here, could learn from you. Now, I've read some of the Dead stuff, and I've caught up with Ledger, so I know some of your continuity doesn't completely match up, right? You are not a slave to or beholden to continuity. If some part of a story hits you, you are still free in your spirit to just let it fly and surprise us readers. How did you learn that to not be beholden to your continuity?
Okay, well, there's two things about the first, how I started doing it in the first place. When I met Steve King for the first time in 2007 at the Edgar Awards, and we sat and talked for a long time, and he had beaten me when I won Best First Novel at the Stokers. I had lost to him for the other award, which was Novel of the Year. And so I was,
And you know what? That you put that on your mantle to lose to
yeah,
Stephen King for novel.
yeah,
Cheers.
and I only lost by 2 votes, but though he pointed out to me that he has 2 sons who are voting members. Anyway, so we were talking, and he said, I told him, he asked what I was going to do, and I said, I'm going to do thrillers, I'm going to do mystery. He said, do this. Bring characters from one story into another. Don't make it dependent that people need to have read the previous book for that character to be effective in it. But he said, your dedicated readers will always follow, that they'll love the Easter egg, and it may lead people into reading your other books. And he said, and you'll have fun. So that was advice he gave me, and I took it. But as far as uh, the way I do it and the continuity, ever since the novel Kill Switch, where Joe Ledger is exposed to the God Machine, that's the point in my career where there are things that happen that aren't in continuity, because the Rotten Ruin future is not his real future. That is one multiverse split. So I have my own Maberry multiverse, and like Joe Ledger met the character Tom Amora 3 separate ways in different flashbacks, in different dream sequences.
Mm.
He the character of Desdemona Fox in 2 different ways, etc. I make reference to the fact that in some stories his uncle was dead, and some he's not.
Right.
So, yeah, and in the Dead of Night series, Joe and his girlfriend Junie have a kid, which, by the way, I will address how that's possible, even though she's technically not able to have.
Not able to, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Uh, amazing what they can do with gene therapy these days. I'm just saying. They are growing new organs, and that part is true. But a uterus is not beyond the possibility of gene therapy within the next 20 years.
Wow.
So yeah, um, so I love playing with things, and the people who follow the books. There are some people who've actually read all my stuff, which I think is bizarre, like they need a life or something. But they've some of them have figured out the points at which certain storylines split off,
Yeah.
and also Joe has seen the future version of himself in one story,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
story Artifact, and that connection is actually coming up soon.
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. There's so much to look forward to. You mentioned Rotten Ruin a couple times. I love when you do YA, you follow a rule that I love, and you don't write down
Yeah.
or not. The audience is always 3 steps ahead of you, and I don't care if they're younger than you.
Well, first off, writing down to kids is stupid because kids are so much smarter than adults give them credit for, and most adults don't remember being kids.
Mm.
We were, especially in my generation, we were far more autonomous. Like, we were thrown out of the house in the morning and came back hopefully alive by dinner time. And, where we were, what we did, parents didn't really particularly much care,
Yeah.
especially
No.
blue collar neighborhoods like I was in.
Yeah.
We had to solve problems for ourselves. And we would make up our own games with our own rules, and we would we'd walk for hours and talk. People forget that as kids they did all that. So, I remember the 14 through 18 were probably the most important years of my life, because so many things changed in my life. My father and I had a fight, and I won, which ended the cycle of abuse in our house. And just meeting people who continue to be lifelong friends and pivotal friends. And I remember the deep conversations we had. So why would I write down
Mm-hmm.
about teenagers when I remember how smart, my crew was? We were, my high school crew, we were choir, debate team, boxing team, wrestling team, and school shows. So we were artists and tough and funny and, whatever. And you can't write down to that crowd. We had our shit together in important ways, and not in other ways, but of course.
Yeah. And I'm from that same generation. And I remember all this, and I came from a very small school, so we all played football and did the class
Yeah,
play, and it was
yeah,
otherwise you couldn't field a team.
right. And so when I decided to do Rotten Ruin, and Rotten Ruin was not originally started for teens. Christopher
Oh.
Golden had invited me to do a novella for an anthology he was doing called The New Dead, where he wanted each of us to write a story that was outside of our comfort zone. And up to that point, I had not written a story about teenagers, and I had not written a story. I got a supporting character teenager in Pine Deep, and I had not written a story, a post-apocalyptic story. So I decided to do that and had a young, skewed worldview kid learning to be a zombie hunter from his older brother. And the story got into the anthology, got a lot of reviews, and my agent said, it reads like the opening of a YA novel. So she said she wanted to take it out shopping, and just on the strength of that opening, that novella, and she got a great deal with Simon and Schuster, and now there are 7 books in the series and a movie in development.
Wow. Is there more books coming, or are you done at 7?
If we go from development to production, I will definitely do more books, because with every series I write, even those that I kind of pause, I always know what's happening next.
Yeah.
It's like when I wrote the first Rotten Ruin novel, like when I was expanding it to the novel, halfway through it, I jumped forward and wrote the end of book 4, because I saw it as a 4-book arc, book of short stories, and then later on a 2-book arc to kind of tell more of the story. But I wanted to know what was going to happen, so I had wrote it. So yeah, there'll be more Rotten Ruin, and there's a ton of Rotten Ruin short stories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me wrap this up by going all the way back to the beginning when you pointed behind you with that Conan, with that El Sprang de Camp, right? And let's talk about now your epic fantasy work, Kagan the Damned, the Son of the Poison Rose. And now I've heard this story too. I just want to tee you up. How did this come to you? You were at dinner. Hit me with this story.
I was there's a restaurant chain here in Southern California called Breakfast Republic, and it's one of the places where I like to go in the morning to eat. And I was just finished doing my morning writing on a different project. I was walking out the door, and my editor called me and said, "Hey, we just had a meeting here, and they're a division of Macmillan, and Tor is a bigger division that has a big market share of epic fantasy, and those divisions are kind of in competition." So he said, "We want to start doing epic fantasy, and my publisher asked me to ask you if you'd be interested in pitching to us." And I'm like, and he said, "If you know anything about epic fantasy," and I gave him my background with Conan and Michael Moorcock and all those, all the fantasy, Carl Wagner stuff. And I said, "Sure." So I went back in the restaurant, another cup of coffee, created a pitch, I don't know, about 20, 25 minutes, sent it to him. Within 2 hours, we had a deal. And it's a trilogy. And I love writing epic fantasy. Oh my God, do I love writing epic fantasy. The world building is fun, but I don't overcrowd the world building.
Right. But there's a lot of lore. There's a lot of lore there, and this still fits into your shared universe. Now, and what was going into this with all your back history of loving Conan, loving Moorcock, what was what highlights did you want to hit with this? I mean, what was your goal? If I go into epic fantasy, I want it to be.
Well, I want there to be magic, but I want magic to be something. I wanted there to be a mystery about it, so magic is returning after 1,000 years, and people don't really know much about it. I wanted the hero to be psychologically damaged, because I wanted to do an epic fantasy that dealt with PTSD, which I'd never read one before. I also wanted him to be a little different in the way he fights, so I didn't want him to be a typical swordsman. So I made him a knife fighter, a dagger fighter. And I even though I studied Kenjutsu, or have been teaching it for a lot of years, which is Japanese swordplay, I if I were to pick a weapon, it would be a knife, short knife. That would be my weapon. Because, little side note, my instructor taught all the big guys in class. I'm 6'4". They taught all the big guys in class to be fast. We were already strong because of our mass, so he taught us to be fast. And a knife fighter who can, move the knife at the speed of his hand is going to win the fight most of the time. That's why Joe Ledger is a knife fighter.
Mm-hmm.
And also I wanted to explore world building, but without falling into the trap of naming every freaking flower or plant or rock, not telling stories that are interesting but have nothing to do with this story. I wanted it so when I did the world building, the reader finds out about the world when they need to know it, and only what they need to know, and I move on. And I don't like the story to get bogged down. And I like stories with politics, and I like stories with compelling characters that are nuanced. And even my villain, who I won't name because not everybody has read the first book.
I've read the first, but not the second.
Okay. Actually, the second has an interesting connection in it, by the way. But the villain in it is a lot more complex even than he appears in the first book. Each book we find out more and more about him, and the third one has some real surprises. But in the
Well, the
second book,
first one had some real surprises.
yes, this has more surprises.
Okay. I'm
It
looking
isn't
forward to
going
it.
to go where you think it's going to go. In the second book, I introduced a character named the Prince of Games, who was Nicodemus from the Joe Ledger series.
Yeah, I've heard he's coming. So I was wondering when he was going to show up. So he
Yeah,
shows
'cause
up in book 2.
the Kagan series is set 50,000 years from now, after society has completely collapsed and kind of crawled back up to a medieval level, you know. And so Nicodemus is an immortal trickster spirit like Loki or Coyote or Nancy. So he's never going to die, and he's there because chaos is more interesting than order. So he's not evil, he's chaotic.
Yeah.
And,
He just wants a front row seat.
yeah, and he wants to nudge things a little bit so there's entertainment.
Yeah.
And he has also a very interesting arc that again does not go where people think it's going to go.
Okay.
And the book Dragon in Winter comes out in the summer of next year.
That was my other one on the list. I got to get book 2 read, so I'm ready for. I've read the first book and I've read the short werewolf story between books 1 and 2. So I'm primed for book 2. So have you found it liberating to work in this genre where you don't have to necessarily delve as deep into research necessarily like you do for your techno thrillers? It's just I can wholesale cloth make it up somewhat. Although it does harken back to your fall of mankind to the zombie apocalypse because the zombies are still there.
Yeah, they are. Though they are not going to play as big a role as some people think. It's not going to be a zombie apocalypse series, but they're players in there. But there is research. I mean, I needed to understand different types of armor. I needed to understand battlefield tactics for pre-firearms era. Books 2 and 3 have elaborate sea battles in them, so I needed to really dive into the different types of ships that they might have, how those ships are manned, and how they're fought. Um, and also, there's a strong Lovecraftian element that runs through all 3 books.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now let me ask you: when your a publisher or editor called you, which one?
Editor.
Editor. When your editor called you, now there's a term going around for a subgenre of fantasy, grim dark, and did they mention this to you because tonally, this is the grimmest of. I mean, this should come in this day and age. This should come with all types of trigger warnings on the cover. You pull no punches, my friend.
And yet, the series is not about. It's not nihilistic. It doesn't. You're not with grimdark. You're pretty sure it's all going to end badly for everyone. And my stories don't do that. Things go bad, and there are sacrifices and losses, but generally there is a path to victory of some sort. Whether they get there or not is another issue. Um, but the Kagan series are, I use the hashtag grimdark sometimes because people expect it, and because it kind of sets an anticipation of the degree of violence and implied violence. Like there's no actual violence against children or women, but it's implied.
No, wait a minute.
It's implied.
Okay. There is brutality in this book. I'm just saying now. I loved it.
I'll give you an example. There is a scene where he comes upon a room full of dead children. He doesn't see any of them get tortured or chopped apart. They're already dead when he gets there. So the implication of horror is there. It's kind of like what Stephen King did in Salem's Lot, where he had the vampire's assistant offering up the child, and the last line of that chapter was, "It became unspeakable." We didn't need to see the child tortured. We would fill in the blanks much more effectively. So many people think that those scenes are on screen in the book, and they're not.
Maybe I was just filling in.
It's a trick. No, it's kind of a trick to get the reader to feel that they have actually been through that experience.
Now it is a trick that I didn't know if I would bring this up or not because I didn't want to spoil for anyone that hadn't gotten into these books, but it is a trick that goes back maybe even before, but to Lovecraft especially, right? Always scarier what's not seen, what you can imagine. And there is such a Lovecraftian ribbon of caramel like through your favorite tub of ice cream running all the way through this. What made you think I'm going to plumb the depths of the mythos in this world?
Well, having read all of the Lovecraft stuff and so much of the Lovecraftian writing written by other folks, it just seems that few people take it off planet or take it into other eras. And I always like taking it to a new field of, of contest. But I didn't want Cthulhu to be the bad guy. He is protective of the cult who worships him. Hastur, who was introduced in The King of Yellow, Robert W. Chambers' book, is the villain, is the evil god, so to speak, in this story, and that's in keeping with some of the stories written about him by Chambers and other people on over there. He actually predates the Lovecraftian cosmic horror. Robert W. Chambers really kind of set the groundwork, along with Lord Dunsany and even Poe and Jules Verne, to set some of the.
Yeah, The King in Yellow is kind of like for those that haven't read it, it's the Ring movie way before the Ring movie, right? Like
It's foundational.
Absolutely.
And so I put other elements in as well. There's the color out of space is in there.
No, it's in there.
Yeah,
There's so much in there. It's just chock-a-block full of East. It is a love letter to not, but also Moorcock's multiverse is
yes.
woven in there. It's such a love letter to everything that I think. When I look at you, Mr. Maberry, I see someone like me that grew up while my mom was shopping, and I was over there at the magazine rack, just like going through creepy and eerie and everything that I could get my hands on. It's just a love letter to everything that we grew up loving, right?
Yep. Yeah. When my brother went to Vietnam, he left me all his EC comics.
Oh,
And I read them faithfully, and I read all the Warren stuff that came out, eerie, creepy, Vampirella, all that. I love the Universal and Hammer horror films. Um, and when you become like when you're gearing up to becoming a writer, with a career, you tend to become an amateur scholar of the foundational works that lead, on which yours are built. So just as I had read all those books written by writers who did the urban Gothic when I was about to do Pine Deep, when I start a new phase, if I haven't already read it, I'll read it, and if I have, I'll reread the ones that I feel are the most important. Like when I have a new series that is very Lovecraftian coming out in May of next year called Necrotech.
okay. I'm
And
writing this down. This I don't know about.
yeah, Necrotech, it's the first in a new imprint called Weird Tales Presents, which is an imprint with Blackstone. And I'm writing the first book. I wrote the first book that'll launch the series May 28th. The short pitch on that is we have a space station out near Jupiter. We're trying to perfect teleportation, and instead of teleporting a test capsule, the entire space station gets teleported 56,000 light years to the far side of the galaxy. And we find out that creatures like Cthulhu and so on came to Earth because they were afraid of what's out there, and now we're out there, and
Like
we're in
this.
deep shit.
You're talking my language. You're in my wheelhouse now, Mister.
So it's basically Aliens meets Event Horizon.
What is it like at this point, Mr. Mayberry, to edit
Just call me
Weird Tales? Jonathan, what is it like? This has to be a bucket list of all bucket lists to be the
Weird
editor of
Tales?
Weird Tales.
Yeah. They had originally contacted me when they were bringing it back. John Harlicker and Tony Eldridge, president, vice president, they contacted me to see if I would want to write a story for them because I knew Tony Eldridge. He was a producer. He produced the Equalizer films, and he's a friend of mine. And he asked if I'd like to write a story for Weird Tales, and it's like that is the stupidest question I've ever been asked. So yes. So I wrote the story, and like a day after they approved the story, the publisher reached out and said the editor who's been doing it is not popular, and he is sick. And we would like you to to finish issue one, the first issue coming back, issue 363, finish it for him. And I said, okay, under like as what? And they said originally it was editorial director. And I said, well, how much did the previous editor do? And he said he bought your story. I said, there's nothing else in the issue. So I said, well, a couple things. First, my time as editor is going to be represented by diversity. I want all types of voices. I want all types of experiences. They're going to include short stories, essays, flash fiction, and poetry. And I said, do you have any objection to that? And they said, no. And I was off and running. And it is surreal. Another little weird backstory. God, there's so many. My wife's grandfather, Oscar J. Friend, who was a pulp fiction writer and literary agent, he was a junior partner of an agency that represented nearly everyone who wrote for Weird Tales. including Ray Bradbury, Richard Matheson, Manly Wade Wellman, the Binder brothers, Robert Bloch, all those guys. When he died in '63, long before I would have met him. All the boxes from that office were in my father-in-law's attic. When he died, those boxes came to me. And there are all the original, like, correspondence with Isaac Asimov, the original contracts, the original typescript manuscript of People of the Black Circle by Robert E. Howard, and the original typescript manuscript of Cool Air by H.P. Lovecraft are all in there.
Wow. At the risk of sounding like Raiders of the Lost Ark, that belongs in a museum.
Yeah, well, I'm going to actually get it. I do want to. I have to hire a professional archivist because some of it has like black mold on it, needs to be preserved in a certain way, and I have allergies. I don't want to dig too much in it, and I want someone to be able to, like, with the two short stories that I have typescripts. The notes say original, but I'm not sure, so I want to get the typing, the actual verified, because if it is original, it should go back to the estates.
Yeah, yeah.
Much as I'd like to keep them. They should go back to the States. And if not, then they should be in a museum somewhere.
Absolutely.
University museum. So eventually, all that stuff will probably be in a university museum.
And you've been so wonderful with your time. One last question.
I could talk to you all day.
One last question, and it's another bucket list question. And for people and you don't have a huge presence on Fantasy BookTube, and that's why I'm so thankful for you talking to me, because especially with you moving into Kagan the Dam, I just think that more people should know what you've done and what you're doing. And they may know what you've done and what you're doing because if they are a fan of the MCU movies, a lot of what they've seen in this Black Panther is pulled straight from your run. And what was that like to see your run up there?
Well, it's funny because when you do a comic book for something like Marvel, it's a work for hire. You have you get royalties on the graphic novel, but they don't need to consult you if they're using any of it. So all I know is that suddenly Marvel contacted me and said, "Hey, we'd like you to come to the world premiere of Black Panther: Wakanda Forever," and they sent me a check so I could, hotel, clothing, anything I wanted. And my son, who's 35, he's like, "You're taking me, right?" Of course, I'm taking you. But up there, sitting there, at the Dolby Theater where they do the Oscars, fifth row with a bunch of other Marvel creators. And right behind us, the entire cast.
Oh my God!
Real as hell. Wasn't a red carpet. It's Wakanda, so it was a purple carpet. Vibranium's purple, and it was amazing. And then the credits come. And watching it, I'm like, I was the first one to put Shuri in the armor. Now, with that, Reggie Hudlin had actually been finishing his run, and the last 6 issues of his run had Nature of the Species, I think it was. Anyway, he had Shuri in the armor, but I actually ghost wrote that story arc. He was really, he knew I was he wanted me to take over the comic after him. And he knew that I had taught women self-defense for a long time. So he said, well, let's have some fun. So he did a storyline where T'Challa got injured and Shuri had to step up, but they brought me in to write her storyline. And then the book went to me. So, I did the first one of just Shuri as the character. I put her up against Namor. Back the big fight scene on the end on the island of that movie, straight out of my comic book. I think issue 10 of my run. And I created the character of Anika, the Dormology with the laser knives, played by Michael Cole, and I created the Midnight Angels, though in my comic, they were a special ops group. But in the movies, they're now a new kind of battle armor for the Dormology. So all of that's out of my run.
So did you know when you went to see the movie, did you know what you were going to see? So how did that hit you? Like, what was that like?
I don't know if I remember all of it. I remember staring like, and my son who had read the comics, he's like, wait, didn't you? And my artists were sitting right in front of me. Will Conrad and Ken Lashley were there. Reggie Hudlin was there. And none of us really knew how much of our stuff was in the movie, and we're freaking out. It was amazing. So we had the best time. Then we went to the after party at the Roosevelt, and that was surreal because aside from the cast and everyone else, you had Jim Gaffigan and Boy George and Damon John and like every celebrity was up there. But it's the weirdest combination of people.
Yeah,
it was and remains surreal beyond words. And I already had a TV show on Netflix, but this have seen my name in the credits of a Marvel movie. Holy
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
it was, the Black Panther was largely responsible for probably saving my life. But I mentioned what a rotter my father was. He also ran the local chapter of the KKK. So it was a terrible home environment. The presence of the Black Panther in the old Fantastic Four issues began the process of me wondering if what my father was telling me was not the truth. And I took that comic in seventh grade to my middle school librarian, and she set me straight. She explained apartheid and intolerance and the Jim Crow laws, and that split us off. Black Panther did that for me.
And then you got a chance to write it and see it on the big screen.
That's there's no part of that that's ever going to feel like it's
Like
any.
reality. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've never done acid or anything, but I'm pretty sure this is what a trip would feel like.
A really good trip. A really
Oh
good
yeah,
trip.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I even have my first comic I ever bought sitting up there. It's Fantastic 466.
So you're a Marvel fan more than DC?
I was a Marvel fan from the jump. I like DC, but I'm 99% a Marvel fan. And I got to write Punisher and Wolverine and Captain America, the Avengers, and Marvel Zombies Return. I co-wrote.
Mm.
So working for Marvel was like they had the editor-in-chief of Marvel had read Patient Zero, my first Joe Ledger book. He picked it up at an airport kiosk in Los Angeles and read it on the flight to New York. Got my phone number, called me up, and said, I'd like the way you handled humor, action, and dialogue. Would you maybe want to write for Marvel? Again, another question that's like,
Yeah.
seriously, do I want to write for Marvel? Let me go check. And I'm glad I have a good business voice on the phone, because I'm like, well, of course you need to talk to my agent, work out a deal. Physically, I'm doing the Snoopy dance around my office.
Yeah. I mean, you're holding the phone away going, let me ask my boyhood self if I want to write for Marvel.
Yeah, and when I hung up the phone, I screamed loud enough to like crack glass. It was, and that's it's been a weird career, because I don't know that I deserve the breaks I've gotten, but I've taken the breaks I've gotten. When something comes along, I don't say that can't happen. Like I had an opportunity to edit X-Files anthologies. And I got on the phone with Chris Carter and I said, look, I want to do X-Files anthologies. I want the stories to be canonical. I don't want them to be just like, and I got the gig. I did 3 X-Files anthologies. I went up writing, I asked him if I could write the official story of Dana Scully as a teenager in a novel. Got that. Reached out to a publisher who had the licensing rights for Alien to ask if I could do an Aliens anthology. Did a couple of those. And that's the fun thing. Sometimes you just need to ask.
Yeah.
A lot of writers are too timid. I mean, what's the worst they can say? No? Writers
Yeah.
are used to the word no. But what if they say yes?
Yeah.
And I find that asking and being a tad audacious about it is a great career impetus.
Well, it's interesting to me because either there's a lot of you in Ledger or there's a lot of Ledger in you, and you didn't hesitate and you asked.
Yeah.
And
don't hesitate much.
I could not be more pleased that I reached out and asked, and you were so generous to give me this time.
And
And
this has been a lot of fun, man.
oh, I let me tell you, I have loved every moment of this. You are everything that I had hoped and dreamed you were. You're one of those guys I grew up with that you carry the flag for us, my brother. It has been so fun.
Well, it's been a lot of fun for me too, because I do a lot of podcasts, a lot of interviews, and there are some you walk away from feeling, well, that was an hour wasted. But you ask good questions and you have conversations rather than just read questions and take answers. Conversational interviews are the best kind. So I feel like I was sitting with a friend talking about stuff.
Well,
That's how it felt.
I feel
appreciate
the
it.
same. And you know what? Maybe this will be the first of some more, and I can't wait to keep reading your stuff. And maybe we can talk again in the future. I've absolutely loved the time.
Yeah, and I've got some stuff that I wish I could tell you now, but it's all under NDA. But some really cool stuff coming up next year.
Okay. Well, when next year would you be able to tell us?
Um, well, there's one project, probably February, and then there's a TV series thing that now that strike is over, if it goes through, I'm going to be executive producer on a really cool TV show.
Okay. So February, I'll reach out February.
Yeah, just follow me on social media too, because some of it will show up there. But the TV series thing, that could be really big and really
Bigger than
fun.
V Wars? Bigger than V Wars?
Well, yeah, it's not based on, it's partly based on my, without giving details, there was a science fiction movie some years ago that was very popular. And I was asked to write, the studio asked me to write two novels that were prequels to it, to kind of set the world in motion of how things happened. And I wrote the prequel novels, and they're not out yet because the guy who wrote the original movie came back and said, "Hey, I would like to do a prequel TV series." And they said, "Well, we already have a couple prequel novels." He read them. And it's like, "Oh, I love this stuff. Let's fold it into my pilot." And then they got one of the Star Wars actors to agree to be the younger version of one of the characters, one of the younger version of a character from the first movie, and things are looking good.
Oh man. Okay. All right. February, Jonathan, I'm reaching out. You can come back
Yep.
and we'll talk again, my friend.
Yep. Sounds great to me, man.
Thank you so much. You were just a gem to give me this time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I had a blast. So thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it.